When biblical authors wrote Genesis, they assumed that the original reader already had certain information. Since the modern reader doesn't have that information, it causes gaps in our understanding of the text. Many have attempted to fill those gaps in various ways, from theological dogma to Jesus himself. But what if we could reconstruct what the original reader knew, or better yet, what the biblical author knew? By identifying glitches in the text, we can reconstruct the oral tradition that Genesis was based on. And through examining how the biblical author changed the oral tradition, we can see that the text is more propaganda than it is religious. We can then use that information to fill in those gaps of understanding. Biblical scholar Dr. Kipp Davis also recognizes that much of the Bible is propaganda. So in today's video, we'll explore highlights from Dr. Kipp's two-part interview on the Apostate of Mind podcast. I'll also share some of my own insights, aiming to deepen our understanding of the Genesis narrative and address any gaps in understanding. Dr. Kipp does an excellent job of highlighting some of the oddities and nuances of the Genesis text. In this first clip, he talks about wordplay in the Garden of Eden narrative.
Now, before we continue, I do want to point out here that this first word, naked, where it says that the man and his woman, the Adam and his woman, were naked. This word in Hebrew is arum. In the plural, it's arumim. And they were not ashamed. And then when it says that the snake or the Nachash was more clever than all the animals of the field, it says that he was more arum. It's a clear play on words here between the snake's resourcefulness and his cleverness and the nakedness of the man and the woman. And I think it's an important point that carries with it implications for our understanding of deity, implications for our understanding of the relationship between knowledge and sex, and between sex and immortality. So these are all very important themes within this story.
While Dr. Kipp and I generally hold similar views, there are a few areas where I differ slightly, and this is one of them. I tend to be more cynical than Dr. Kipp, as I don't believe the biblical author was attempting to primarily make philosophical statements about sex, deity, or immortality. Instead, I suspect the author may have been trying to exclude parts of the oral tradition. When the biblical redactors added onto existing text, their manipulation was restricted by that text. In contrast, altering an oral tradition provided much more flexibility. That freedom allowed for a greater degree of manipulation, including the use of sonic elements. In other words, instead of being bound to the exact words of the oral tradition, biblical authors could occasionally substitute similar sounding words to alter the meaning. And I think that may be the case with arum and arom. In the oral tradition, the serpent was naked, but by using a word that sounded like naked, but was actually crafty, the biblical author offers the original reader a plausible misunderstanding. Oh, you thought the serpent was naked? No. He was crafty. I won't recount in detail my reconstructed oral tradition of the Garden of Eden narrative, but if you're interested in learning more and seeing how I approach the reconstruction, be sure to check out my video on that subject. For now, I'll provide a brief summary of what I believe the oral tradition entailed. There were 4 gods and goddesses in the story. They were Eve, Adama, the serpent, and Elohim. The goddess Adama created the first human named Cain to be a slave. There was no Adam. Adam is just a generic name so that the biblical author could remove Cain from that part of the oral tradition. Then Adama sold Cain to Elohim's wife Eve. Cain and Eve fell in love. Eve wanted a body of flesh so she could be with Cain. The serpent provides Eve with flesh, but in the process tricks her by getting her pregnant. And finally, Elohim finds out and curses Eve, the serpent, and Adama. So I think it's when the serpent gets Eve pregnant that he was naked in the oral tradition. But that didn't fit in the biblical narrative, so changing it to crafty was a clever way of manipulating the narrative. We can see the remnants of other sexual language from the oral tradition as well. Dr. Kipp discusses that in the next clip.
And that's the other part of this story that we haven't touched on at all, and that's the sexual innuendo that's built into the eating from the tree of knowledge. The verb that's most commonly used by the non-priestly writer in Genesis for coitus, for sexual intercourse, is yada, which means to know. And I don't think this is an accident that it's the tree of knowledge of good and bad. And there is some ambiguity here in the story about whether or not this was a sexual connection made between the woman and the snake, the serpent, the Nakash.
So I think Dr. Kipp is correct here in that there does seem to be sexual language in the narrative. But that language is a remnant from the oral tradition, and without a biblical scholar like Dr. Kipp, you'd probably never even notice it. And that's just how the biblical author wanted it. The mistake here by some is to think that the biblical author was trying to covertly insert sexual content on the down low. But it's just the opposite. He was trying to exclude it from the narrative, but also had to include some of it because it was in the oral tradition. It's propaganda at its finest. Let's take a look at the next clip.
And and there's certainly like lots of the imagery at play in the story with the tree is desirable. It's pleasing to the eye. The image of eating is occasionally used in the Hebrew Bible as a metaphor for lust and for sexual gratification. So, it's kind of connected in there.
So again, Dr. Kipp does an excellent job of sussing out the sexual language in the text. And when it comes to oral traditions, it makes sense that sex would be a big part of the narrative. Sex sells, or rather, in the ancient Near East, sex promulgates oral tradition. Horny shepherds, or any male for that matter, would have been keen to hear a story about sex at the end of a long day, and then tell their friends the next day. There are other oral traditions that contain sex as a major part of the narrative. You can watch my videos about the following reconstructed oral traditions. Ruth has sex with Boaz. David has sex with Saul's wives. Jezebel was a prostitute with Ahab. My podcast episode about how Sisera raped Jael. And my blog post about Uriah having sex with Bathsheba. But there were also a couple of other topics that were quite popular in oral traditions. One of them was trickery. I already mentioned that I think the serpent tricked Eve by getting her pregnant in the oral tradition. Dr. Kipp finds trickery in other narratives as well.
So, and I'll just point this out as well. Within many, in particular within the Near Eastern, particularly nomadic cultures from the region, one of the things that we see that is championed is trickery and cleverness. The whole cycle of the stories of Jacob that appear in the later part of the book of Genesis, in particular, in starting in like Genesis 22, I think, into the 30s. Jacob is very often championed for being a clever man who gets the best of people who are in positions of greater power than he is. This is a common theme. This is a trope that appears in particularly the later parts of the book of Genesis. And I think this makes sense too. Within a culture where particularly these nomadic cultures which were roaming around in the vicinity of these large, imposing, powerful Canaanite cities, they're the little guys. They're the outsiders. In order to get by, sometimes you have to take advantage of those who are in positions of greater authority and power than you are. So this isn't necessarily a vice as far as the biblical author is concerned, right? Guile and cleverness is something that is lionized in a lot of texts. Jacob dupes his older brother into giving him his birthright. He dupes his father-in-law Laban into acquiring the best part of Laban's flocks and his holdings. This is part of the narrative, part of the story. In fact, Jacob's the name Yaakov in Hebrew comes from a verb, the cognates of which in Akkadian, it's either Akkadian or Ugaritic, actually means to trick or to deceive. So it's it's a good question. It's a good point that you raise, but I don't know if we have an appropriate understanding of the value that people from antiquity, when they read this story in its original context, if they would have set the same sorts of values on some of these ideas. I suspect probably not in many instances.
In the oral tradition of Jacob, Jacob was a slave of Laban, and Jacob's trickery was originally the taking of all of Laban's possessions, even his family. The biblical author had to come up with alternative reasons as to why Jacob possessed Laban's livestock, idols, and children. He also shifts Jacob's acts of trickery to focus on selling Esau a bowl of soup in exchange for his birthright and deceiving Isaac to receive Esau's blessing. Additionally, by having Jacob grasp Esau's heel at birth, the biblical author reframes the origin of Jacob's name from meaning he cheats to he takes by the heel. Jacob's trickery was too well known for the biblical author to deny, but he does feel comfortable changing what the trickery was about. On the other hand, the biblical author does feel comfortable denying that Jacob was a slave, but he still has to provide a reason as to why Jacob worked for Laban for 14 years with no pay. Jacob's 2 wives served that purpose. I'll talk more about slavery in the oral traditions in a bit. Let's take a look at another passage in the Garden of Eden narrative. In Genesis 2:17, it says, "But from the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for on the day that you eat from it you will certainly die." This causes issues for some, since Adam and Eve did not die on that day. Dr. Kipp discusses.
And then with regards to like what Yahweh tells Adam and Eve, it really does seem like the simple reading is that he lied. He didn't really tell the truth, because I was going to say, is it possible that initially, because like I'd say modern readers would take issue, like if they believe in the omniscient God, God can't lie kind of perspective, that you would immediately be hit with this dilemma and therefore try to come up with some sort of way to explain it away. But is it possible that early on that was not the case?
Yeah, I think you can look at this a couple of different ways, right? Is he performing a misdirection? Is he telling them something? Because that's like one way to look at this is he's so determined that my friend Michael, the Canadian atheist, is here, and he has noticed my t-shirt. So that's the for all y'all Americans out there, this is the logo for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation.
Oh wow, very creative.
Yes. It's good, eh? Yeah, I think it's a nice logo.
Fun fact about me, I grew up across the river from Canada and received Canadian broadcast, so the CBC logo was imprinted into my childhood memories.
The CBC. Anyways, so there's a couple different ways you can look at this. Is God performing a sort of hyperbole? I've seen it read this way, where he could be saying something like, if my kid, my second oldest, has a tendency to just take things, and borrow them that don't belong to him. He'll oftentimes just grab my shoes because they fit him, which is really annoying when you're trying to leave the house and your shoes aren't there because he's wearing them. Things like this, right? So, it wouldn't be unusual for me to say to my son, if you take my shoes, I'm going to kill you. Or if you take my bike for a ride without asking me, I'm going to kill you. So is this what God is doing? Is he saying, if you eat of this tree, you're going to die? As a means of just emphasizing the cruciality of how much he doesn't want this to happen? Or is this a form of misdirection because he's doing something deceitful? Like, do you see the difference here?
Yeah, I can totally make sense of that as well.
And I don't know if I have a good answer to that. I think you can go in either direction.
Again, I'm going to differ slightly from Dr. Kipp here due to my cynicism. As propaganda, the biblical author never risks allowing any of his key points to be unclear. I think this is yet another element from the oral tradition that the author couldn't fully exclude, but had difficulty making it fit within the biblical narrative. In the oral tradition, Eve lost her immortality when Elohim cursed her. So if we read it as, "You will certainly lose your immortality," it makes sense in the oral tradition. But in the context of the biblical narrative, it only makes sense in terms of physical death. However, the biblical author doesn't care if you think Elohim tricked Adam and Eve or any other conclusion you make, just as long as you don't conclude that Eve was a goddess who lost her immortality. He only includes a saying from the oral tradition so that it legitimizes the new narrative. The last topic I want to discuss, which was prevalent in oral traditions, is slavery. You can imagine that stories about slaves gaining their freedom would spread, especially among the slave community. For example, some oral traditions involving slavery include Jacob being enslaved by Laban, Cain serving as Eve's slave, Abigail as David's slave, and Ruth as Boaz's slave. Dr. Kipp picks up on the slavery language in the text.
The Adam was created for the earth, that is, like, to work the ground, right?
Right.
More specifically, he was created to cultivate and look after the garden of God. Now, when this station is jeopardized by his acquisition of knowledge, like a god, he can no longer stay in the garden. The man and the woman are banished, but in a bit of a subversive way, they're also emancipated. Like they're no longer confined to this space to work for the God, to work Yahweh's garden.
Sure.
They're free from the slavery of the garden. They become their own masters, slaves to their own destiny.
Once again, I don't think the biblical author was trying to make a philosophical point about freedom, but was obfuscating the oral tradition that Cain was a slave. But in the biblical narrative, the author still had to incorporate elements of the oral tradition. This may be why the biblical narrative oddly says that Cain was acquired by Eve. Additionally, Cain bore a mark. This is interesting because slaves often had a tattoo as a sign of ownership. To learn more about why I think Cain was a slave in the oral tradition, I'll refer you once again to my video on the Garden of Eden narrative. That's it for today. Thanks for watching, and please like, share, and subscribe.